here at the college when it was here, and to come back has just been an incredible gift. Kirk gave me a great tour of the city yesterday and of the church, and you need to know, this might be the most beautiful sanctuary that I've ever taught in. It is stunningly remarkable, and the glass, everything about the intentionality of the design and what's been done here is really spectacular. And I love the work you're doing outside as well. And that it communicates that your church is alive, that your church is growing, that your church is thriving, that your church is here to serve the community. And well done, Living Hope Church, well done. Not every church communicates that as clearly as you do. But you know, as much as Kirk was grateful and excited about the facility, he spoke with such joy for the people of Living Hope and for the staff. And he even gushed without any prompting about Eric Miller, which was really wonderful for me to hear. I can hardly find words to describe the honor it is to have this little part in Eric's ordination service. I first met Eric when he was about 8 years old. He was just a sweet, adorable, cute little boy running around the church. And I'm not sure how cute he is anymore, but once you get to know him, you realize he's incredibly sweet and adorable still. And some things you need to know about Eric, in case you haven't figured this out yet. He comes from a remarkable family in that his parents are amazing people, though his mother is slightly crazy, so watch out for her. But his grandparents on his father's side are here, and they're just good and godly people. I did know Eric's grandfather, who was a Baptist pastor, and I think he would be smiling down from heaven, but I knew his grandmother. And she was one of the sweetest, kindest, most lovely women you could meet. He has an older brother and sister who are incredible siblings and who have modeled passion and excellence and faith in Jesus in an extraordinary way that has helped shape who Eric has become. He loves to serve, and if he doesn't know how to do something, just give him a few hours and he'll figure it out because he's that bright. Eric's confident, but he's not arrogant. He's smart, but he's not annoying. He's not often. He's strong, but he's not rude. He's kind, but he's not weak. And finally, you need to know, most importantly maybe of Eric, is that he married way over his head. And Danielle's incredibly kind and gracious, and she has found a way to hold on and develop her cuteness as well, too. So that's a great thing. I want to talk a little bit to Eric this morning, but I'm really talking to all of us, and myself included. But when I say something specific to Eric, just put your name in there and see if it applies for you today. A couple of weeks ago in my church, I shared a story about a young guy named Ralph Kettner who had a dream to build a grocery store in his small town of Salisbury, North Carolina in the late 1950s. There was only one problem. He had a great dream, but like many dreamers, he had no money whatsoever to fulfill the dream. So he literally used the town phone book. He called every person he knew with an invitation to invest in this venture. He found 87 friends who would buy at least 10 shares in his new store for $100. The numbers on the returns of that initial investment are staggering. Today, that little store has developed into the Food Lion supermarket chain in the southeastern United States. There are over 1,000 supermarkets with that name, over 60,000 employees. Let's just say that as the store prospered, so did 86 of the 87 original investors. They're all millionaires today, or their families are, because of that bold little investment that they made back in 1957. But I said only 86 of the 87 did well, because the 87th guy was a guy named Jim Woodward, and he got tired of cutting his lawn with a push mower. He decided he needed a riding lawnmower. So he sold his shares that had already increased in value significantly, but he sold them, and in selling them, he gained enough money to buy a riding lawnmower. And several years ago, he lamented that he's the only guy in his community that has a $5 million lawnmower sitting in his garage. It's a vivid reminder of the simple truth that every choice that we make in life comes with corresponding consequences. And we learn this throughout the scriptures. but we learn it best from Jesus. And so I want to take a look at a day in the life of Jesus from Mark chapter 1. If you have your Bibles or your phones, I invite you to turn there. Mark chapter 1. And I'm going to do something different. We're going to look from verses 35 to 42. But I'm going to do something that if Ross Ingram and Fred Sonnenberg could be here and hear me do this, they'd be horrified. But I'm going to preach it backwards. I'm not going to talk backwards or anything. But I'm going to start at the end of the text and move back to what I think is the core of the text. And I think it might make some sense to you. But work with me carefully and closely here. Eric, I want to tell you today that the most important thing about you is not how gifted you are and how bright you are and how capable and competent you are, though you are all of that and more. And that the most important thing about you that's already been stated is your walk with Jesus, and it's your relationship with him. And that's true of all of us that are here today. Here's my sermon in a sentence. Nothing matters more than learning to live like Jesus lived, learning to love like Jesus loved, learning to serve like Jesus served. And this is the pathway to a consequential, impactful, significant life story. So let's jump in. We see at the very end of this, in that Jesus heals a man with leprosy. Verse 40 says, a man with leprosy came to him, begged him on his knees, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand. He touched the man. And immediately, the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. We see in Jesus this profound compassion that caused him to reach out and touch a leprous man. He took compassion and caring for people to entire new levels in this healing encounter. In this incredible encounter between humanity and divinity, there's one who's called untouchable. He was no doubt well acquainted with his condition. He was eager enough to be cleansed. He was humble enough and faith-filled enough to ask that the Lord might touch him. But there's also one whose life was marked by profound compassion. One so filled with love that he was willing to reach out his hand to touch the untouchable, the leprous. The needs of this leprous man so gripped Jesus' heart that he violated taste and culture, and he reached out and he touched him. When we stop to think of the cultural taboo of contact with the leprous and the horror of it, the account really becomes staggering. You know that any person who was identified as a leper was reduced to the most pitiful state of existence. In addition to the physical challenges of the disease, there were cultural barriers. They had to live outside of their communities. If they entered into the town, they had to cry out, unclean, unclean. If they entered into the what do you call those places where they worshiped? When they entered into the synagogue, they'd have to sit at the very back. And they were in a caged off area, kept from contact with anyone, any of the other worshipers. In the Bible, the leper is the symbol of the ultimate outcast, infected by a disease they did not seek, rejected by those they knew and avoided by people they didn't know. They were condemned to a life of isolation and loneliness, facing a future without hope of anything ever getting better. So imagine the physical horror. Imagine the social isolation. Imagine the emotional scars. Imagine the spiritual loneliness. And then, if you could, try to imagine feeling the touch, the hand, the heart of Jesus. Rather than feeling rejection and isolation, for the first time in who knows how long, he felt the touch of another, the touch of Jesus. And I remind you, and you know well, that Jesus didn't have to touch people to heal them. He could send them to a priest. He could spit on them. He could just say a word. But in this case, he reached out and he touched him because Jesus loved vulnerable people. And church, the call of God upon all of our lives is that we would love vulnerable people. We would reach out helping hands instead of condemning fingers. We ought not ever to watch the news without praying. We ought never hear the sound of a first responding ambulance or fire truck or police car without saying a prayer. We're quick to judge sometimes, and we're slow to love. This compassion needs to be the defining characteristics of our lives if we're going to ever want to live the life that Jesus lived. I've never met a person with leprosy, but I met all kinds of people who feel marginalized and isolated, alone, invisible. You know, some kids say they wish they had the supernatural ability of invisibility. But if you live it as a teenager or a young adult or an adult, it's heartbreaking. Feeling like nobody sees, nobody cares, nobody values them. There's a lack of community, a lack of joy, a lack of hope. Henry David Thoreau wrote many years ago, most men in this world live out their lives in quiet desperation. Loneliness visits all of us some of the time, and it visits some of us all of the time. There are people in your community. There are people in this church. There may be people in your home who feel invisible. Are we compassionate followers and servants of Jesus? Several years ago at a church I previously served, there was a single mom who had two 20-year-old handicapped boys. And they moved into our community and started attending our church. And these boys were fairly high-functioning, though it was easy to see their deficits. They were a ton of fun. And they loved running around church on Saturday nights. And they just got to know all kinds of people. Their mother dealt with a debilitating back pain and eventually couldn't even find her way to church. But one of our pastors, Rick, lived close enough by that he would pick them up and bring them. He'd take them to hockey games. He'd do all kinds of things with them. Their last Saturday night in church, before the family moved back to Eastern Canada, Rick brought them up onto the stage, and Rick wasn't very big, but these boys were even smaller, put his arms around both of them, had a microphone kind of like this. And he said, "These guys are my friends, and I'm going to dearly miss them." One of the boys, the more verbal of the two, thanked the church, thanked Rick, thanked me for being their friends, and said how much they would miss us. Rick prayed a blessing over them, but I'll never forget what he did next. With his arms around both boys, he said, "Jerry and Joel are my friends, and I love them, and I'll miss them deeply." He said, "Here's the thing. We can't be everything to everyone, but we need to be something to someone. And the mission of our life is to figure out who the someone is and what the something looks like." Is there evidence of that kind of compassion in our lives? Did your spouse, your kids, your neighbor, your parents, your fellow worshiper experience compassion from you this morning? Compassion begins at home, and it moves into the church, and it moves into the community. It takes us wherever God takes us. We're never more like Jesus than when we're extending profound compassion and serving others. God would never give us too much to do, that we would not have time or compassion for those who are in need of an expression of his love. Are we authentic? Eric, never forget, you're a pastor first. You're a leader. You run the worship arts department. You do all kinds of things, seen and unseen, appreciated and unnoticed. But foremost, you're a pastor, and shepherd well the people that God has brought to you. All of us need to find a way to be compassionate. But there's another thing we learn about Jesus. If we go a little earlier into the story, he wasn't just profoundly compassionate. He was incredibly intentional. If you take a look, it says he's off praying. We'll get there at the end. But Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everybody's looking for you." And Jesus said, "Let's go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." It takes great wisdom to discern God's call upon our lives. John Ortberg tells a great story about a man who arrived at the pearly gates of heaven, and he meets St. Peter there. And Peter asks him, brand new to heaven, he goes, "Is there anything that you've ever done in your life that is significantly valuable and important and meaningful?" And the guy goes, "Well, I can think of one thing." And he goes, "What's that?" He goes, "Well, I once came upon a gang of high testosterone bikers who were threatening a young woman. I directed them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't listen, so I approached the largest, most heavily tattooed biker. I smacked him on the head. I ripped out his nose ring. I kicked his bike over. I told him to leave her alone or they'd have to deal with me." Well, St. Peter was pretty impressed by this courage. He goes, wow, that's amazing. He goes, when did this happen? And the guy goes, about 2 minutes ago. How do we know when to step in and step up and take risks? And how do we know when to just, stand by and wait and respond in a different kind of way? The day before this encounter with the leper, Jesus had experienced an intense day of ministry with vulnerable people. He taught people, he cast out evil spirits, he'd healed the sick. People took notice, they were amazed. They wanted to see and experience more. And Mark writes in verse 33 that the entire town gathered at the door of the place where they thought Jesus would come to speak. In a minute, we'll see the primary way in which Jesus navigated the demands of ministry life, but I first want us to see just how he lived his life. Look at verse 36. He's alone praying, and Simon and some of the disciples come looking for him. Roughly translated, I'm no Greek scholar, but I think it means they hunted him down. And when they found him, they exclaimed, everybody's looking for you, which roughly translates means, what in the world are you doing out here wasting time in the desert when there are piles of people waiting to see you? They were frustrated. They felt like Jesus was missing a great opportunity to draw some attention to his cause and perhaps to his disciples. They felt the temptation that every pastor battles. Numbers, Jesus, numbers. Nothing validates a ministry like numbers. And numbers are waiting and you're out here praying. Come on, let's go. It's time to do the important things. I love Jesus' answer. He says, actually, guys, I'm not going back to Capernaum. There are other places to go and serve and teach and heal today. His answer reveals that Jesus was deeply aware of just what it was that he was supposed to do with his life. He was focused. He was intentional. Just because there's a need doesn't mean there's a corresponding call. He told his disciples that he was going to another place that day. And what that teaches us is that we deeply need to know what it is that God wants us to do with our lives. We can't live up to all of the expectations that people will have upon us, but we can fully enter into the opportunities that God prepares for us. Jesus didn't want to be thought of as a servant. He just wanted to serve God and neighbor. His priorities were set by the plan of God, not by the whims of people. He lived modeled a focused, intentional life. We all get somewhere in life, and some of us get somewhere on purpose. How purposeful are you? And where does the will of God and the priority of God and the purpose of God fit in the priority structure of your life? We all have our own way of hearing God and responding to his voice. But what would be different if all of us, the very first thing before our feet hit the carpet in our bedrooms or whatever kind of flooring you have, what if the first thing that we did is we said, Lord, for another day we are beyond grateful. Let us be aware of your presence. Let us be filled with your spirit. Let us be women and men that love you and seek to serve all that you bring across our paths. Let us be faithful to your call and purpose for our life this day. Not my will, but your will be done in my life. What if we prayed that defining prayer of Jesus' life? Well, how did Jesus learn to be so compassionate and so focused and intentional? It's the heart of the text that I want to end with. Jesus was deeply faithful to the Father. It was very early in the morning. He'd had an intense day of ministry. If ever there was a time to sleep in, if there was a little time to just have a little downtime, this would have been the day. But early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and he left the house and he went off to a solitary place where he prayed, where he encountered the Father, where he embraced the Father's purposes for his life, when he experienced the love of the Father and knew that it needed to flow out of him in everything that he did. He was deeply faithful. So many demands, so many people needing so many things, the whole town at the door, the disciples demanding even that he show up. And in the midst of all the expectations and obligations, we find Jesus seeking the quiet place. No wonder there was such power and authority in his life. No wonder there was such compassion and focus in his life. I'm convinced that the foundational ingredient for finding peace and stability in both our personal lives and in our public lives is found in spending time with the Father, where character is forged and where our commission in life is discovered. Jesus demonstrated for us brilliantly that strength and direction is the fruit of time alone with the Father. I've been reading through some of the kings in the story of David, and it says over and over again that the Lord was with David and he became mighty in battle. Eric, intimacy always comes before influence. And it's David's intimacy with God that made him the influential king and leader that he became. And what's true for him is true for you, is true for all of us. If we don't know how to learn to be still and alone with God, we might live nice, respectable lives. But Jesus came to make us so much more than nice and respectable. And what might be the most impactful book next to my Bible in my life, John Ortberg, a book called Soul Keeping, writes, if our souls are healthy, no external circumstance can destroy your life. And if your soul is unhealthy, no external circumstance can redeem your life. Jesus models a foundation of life that's beyond the power of circumstance and situation and current reality. He pursued the quiet place. And I'm going to guess that if you're at all like me, sometimes we're too unfamiliar with the quiet place. Sometimes I wander into the sanctuary in my church. It's not nearly as beautiful as this. You've got something special here. We have sort of early American warehouse style of sanctuary, a big box, but it's a sacred place because it's been dedicated to God, his purposes. But sometimes I go in there, and when I first get in there, because there's not natural light, I can't see anything. But I've become familiar with the sanctuary, and I know where the aisles are, and I know how to get around it, and I know how to make my way to the altar. And oftentimes when I do that, there's enough light that creaks through under doors, and maybe there's an open door somewhere, that I begin to see a little bit, and I can walk around the sanctuary and pray and do whatever it is that I'm about to do. But I was thinking about that a while ago, and I thought, that's like me spending time with God. Sometimes when I start to spend time with God, it all seems so dark. And sometimes I bail for an activity that's safer and easier and seemingly even more productive. And I miss out on that intimacy with him. But when I persist in my intimacy with him, things become kind of dark. He comes to me and he opens my eyes, and I begin to discover his presence and his purpose. Remember that old chorus, those of us that are old here, we used to sing, this is how old I am. I can't even remember what it was because it's not in my notes. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And I remember hearing someone at a pastor's retreat speak, and he said, really it ought to say, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will become remarkably clear in the light of his glory and grace. And we understand what's valuable and what's significant and what matters and what leads us into a consequential, impactful, significant experience of life. Does your private life match and empower your public life? Several years ago, I enrolled in a course that was called Energy for Performance. And it was kind of Christian-based, but it was a personal coaching program toward developing a personal development plan for spiritual, physical, and emotional wellness. I was really excited about it. And I knew that I was in trouble, though, when I got a phone call Tuesday morning at 10:30 from the receptionist at the church that was hosting this. It was about 40 minutes away from the church I serve. And she asked if I was still planning on coming. I said, absolutely. I am so excited and so looking forward to this. I'll see you tomorrow morning. And then she kind of paused. There was an awkward silence. And she said, it actually started at 8:30 this morning. And so I said, really? I said, I'll be there as soon as I can. And I canceled the day and got in my vehicle, drove as fast down Deerfoot Trail as I legally could, probably faster than I legally should have. And the whole time I felt like such a fool. And I felt like my life was out of control. And God spoke to me that day as clearly as I've ever heard him speak. And he said, Ian, he said, your output level is here. Your parents are aging. Your church is demanding. Your kids are challenging ages. You give and you give and you give, and you output at this level, but you input your life at this level in terms of how you take care of your body, how you feed yourself, how you sleep, how you pray, how you read, how you worship. And there's a gap. And I thought, well, how do I function at this level when I input at this level? And I felt like God said to me, you create an artificial source of energy called stress. And stress enables you to function at this level. I don't know if there's any science to this, but I think there is. Stress allows us to do things that we normally wouldn't have capacity to do. But stress takes far more than it gives, and it requires payback at some point. And I thought, how long can I keep doing this? Another 15 years? Maybe. Another 15 months? Maybe. Another 15 minutes? Until my heart says you're done? Till my wife says I'm done? Till my church says it's over? We can't go through life outputting at this level and inputting at this level, because one day we'll pay a price and everything will collapse. So church, how are you inputting your life? Are you taking care of yourself, your body, your soul, your relationships, the things that matter most in life? I did a funeral on Tuesday for a man who thought he had 20 years of retirement left, and he never woke up. And I don't want to be morbid or fearful or manipulative, but we need to make the most of every day that we get, because every day is a gift. And we need to know what God wants from us, and we need to extend profound compassion, and it all comes out of an intimate encounter with the one who loves us more than we could ever begin to imagine. What needs to be different in how we live our lives? Are we pursuing dull, habitual religious living, or do we have an encounter with Jesus that just fills us with joy and passion and hope and wonder and expectation every day of our lives? I'm troubled when I see the crevasse that grows between what I believe and how I live some days. And I think the only thing that bridges that gap is spending time with the Father, pursuing his heart. So Eric, all of us, are we taking care of our souls? I suggest that the best thing you can do for Danielle, the best thing you can do for Living Hope Church, the best thing you can do for your neighbors in your community is to live a life in such a way that you can honestly say, it is well with my soul. Because when we're living with soul wellness, there's something powerful and beautiful about our lives. Let me end with this story. A couple of years ago, there was a young dad in our church who was obviously losing a very severe battle with cancer. The disease had taken 100 pounds off his body, taken the hair from his head, the strength from his limbs. But it could not take the hope that was in his soul. He came to church one Sunday, just a week or so before he died. He could barely walk. He was so vulnerable and weak. He had a tube coming out of his nose because he couldn't take food anymore. He was being fed through the tube. He was gaunt. He was pale, but he desperately wanted to come to church with his two young boys and his wife and to worship Jesus. After church, I met them in the foyer, and his wife went to get the kids from Sunday school. And I said, Dave, come with me. And I took him to the only seat that was available in our foyer at the time. And there was a man sitting there, and the man sitting beside him, or there, that he ended up sitting beside, was my father. My father doesn't come to church a lot, especially now because he's pretty frail. But he's got a relationship with God that kind of amazes me sometimes. And so I introduced my dad to Dave and my Dave to my dad, Dave to my dad, and I went and greeted people. And 5 minutes later, his wife came with the kids, so I went over. And Dave struggled to stand up, and my dad struggled to stand up. And my dad turned to him and took his hand and said, Dave, it is pretty easy to see that you're in a pretty challenging physical battle right now. But I want you to know that there is an aura of wellness that exudes from your life. And it has been my privilege to meet you this morning. They're likely the most profound words I've ever heard my father speak. So let me ask you, is there an aura of wellness that exudes from your life today? That aura of wellness comes from living a life of profound compassion, of deep intention, of complete surrender to the one who loves you more than you could ever begin to imagine. And church, as we consider this day in the life of Jesus, remember that as he was there for the leprous man, so he is here for each one of us. The God who came still comes. And the God who renewed still renews. And the God who encouraged still encourages. And the God who blessed still blesses. And the God who healed still heals. The God who changed lives still changes lives. Do you need his wellness in your soul today? Just surrender to him. For the first time in a long time, or for the first time ever. And say, I need you, and I love you, and I trust you, and I will follow you. At your wedding, Eric and Danielle, almost 4 years ago, I told you that as much as you belong to each other, you belong to Jesus first. And God's highest calling upon you, Reverend Miller, is not to be a fantastic pastor, though I believe you're becoming one. It's to be an authentic follower of Jesus and lover of your family. Nothing matters more. You are God's chosen and beloved son. I also encouraged you to make great choices about how you live your life. I encouraged you to embrace the adventure of life with Jesus at the center. And I do the same today. That life is a life of compassion, a life of surrender, a life of dependence.